Okay, it's 6:01. Let's call the meeting to order. Next, roll call.
Oh, yep. So Melissa, present. Robert Bonner's excused. Gabriel? Here, okay. Dominic?
Here.
Leslie?
Here.
Shay is excused. Irma? Don't see Irma. And Robert Moxley?
He's here. He just went off my screen for a minute.
Okay.
Doug, just for the recording, it's November 4th. This is the Middle Housing Committee meeting.
Thank you. All right, Melissa, now we're on to approval of the minutes.
So can I have a motion for approval of the minutes by people who were here last time?
Don't everybody speak at once. All you have to do
approve the minutes.
There we go.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, Dominic second. All approve? Aye.
Everybody say aye.
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 All right, they passed. All
Okay.
right. So now we'll move on to welcome and introduction. So we have with us tonight our consultant team. So we have Steve Faust from 3J Consulting, Heather Austin from 3J Consulting, and I'll let them introduce themselves. And we have Leslie Decker from Jet Planning. So everybody gets a little bit acquainted. I know we did this at our last meeting, but if you could go around, introduce yourself, maybe a little tidbit about you, that will help our consultant team. So Melissa, why don't we start off with you?
Okay, I'm Melissa Daly. I've been here in Newberg since, I think I moved here in 2012. I have a daughter who is in 7th grade doing distance learning, and I've been working in affordable housing for almost 15 years. So, is that it?
Gabriel?
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I have some issues. This is a different laptop than last time. So my name is first name Gabriel, last name Škulec. I am a Newberg resident since 2016. I moved over from the Seattle area. My daughter, she graduated at George Fox, and that's probably why I ended up here. And at some point I started to be interested in tiny houses, and specifically tiny houses on wheels. So look, I have hands-on experience now because I own a tiny house for more than 2 years, and I spent there at least a year living in the tiny house and also working with the city on how to get tiny houses, I don't know what's the proper word, but probably legalized.
Okay. Thank you. Dominic?
Hey, I'm Dominic Seymour. I'm a graduate of Newberg High School. I've been living in Newberg since 2015, this go around. I run a small business installing fireplaces and doing gas piping and tile work. So I'm kind of a guy who does all my own projects and loves to build, and I just love to be a part of this committee and see what we can do for our citizens.
Okay. Leslie?
Hi, I'm Leslie, and I came to Newberg in '93 to go to George Fox and haven't left. Our youngest is in 8th grade doing distance learning. It's awesome. And I'm also the lead pastor at North Valley Friends Church, and we have a couple tiny homes on site.
Robert Moxley. Robert, we don't have any audio on you. Okay. Well, Robert's out there. He's in the shadows. He's waving his hands. So he's a happy camper. All right. Thank you all. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Steve and his team, and they're going to walk you through the material we sent out. We do have a PowerPoint. So Steve, would you like us to pull up the PowerPoint at this point?
Sure, that sounds fine.
Okay. All you have to do for Sue is just tell her next slide and she'll advance it for you.
I'm very practiced at that sort of thing. You can go ahead to the next slide. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Steve Faust. I'm the Community Planning Director at 3J Consulting. I'm very happy to be working in the city of Newberg on this project. We have quite a bit of experience doing similar work from some previous funding from DLCD in different communities around the state in 2018. And for that effort and for this effort, we teamed with Jet Planning, and Elizabeth will introduce herself in just a bit. But we are we are the lead firm for this project, and we're doing about 3 or 4 other similar projects in other cities throughout the state for this 2020 funding. So I'm very excited to meet you all and look forward to diving into some of these really, some people might find them boring, but they're really important topics for the future of your community. Heather, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Heather Austin. I'm a senior planner with 3J, and I've been part of the team since 2018, working with Elizabeth and Steve and some of our other colleagues doing housing projects throughout the state. So really enjoy this kind of work and glad to get a chance to work in Newberg.
And Elizabeth.
Yeah, hi there, everybody. Elizabeth Decker, Jet Planning, which is my own consulting firm, which is really just my way of being able to do work on zoning projects. So I do a lot of zoning, either one-on-one with cities or partnering with larger firms on implementation projects like 3J. So I write zoning code of residential, mixed use, a whole range of things, but certainly my favorite project these days are these missing middle housing code updates. And luckily, the state legislature with HB 2001 appropriated some money so that we get to work in Newberg and, as Steve mentioned, a few other communities. So just really excited to drill down and see what this means for Newberg. As we get into it, you'll see there's some unique challenges and like interesting puzzles to work on. So I think this will be a really engaging project, and I'm glad to have you all here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So just looking at our agenda quickly, I'm going to take just a few minutes to go through a project overview, because I know Doug already did that with you at a previous meeting, but I'll just touch on a few items and then hand it over to Elizabeth to walk you through the draft housing code audit. What we found when we looked at the code relative to some of the work that's been done around House Bill 2001, and some possible concepts for updates that we might make. And I think rather than waiting till her presentation is done, we're going to be kind of discussing as we go along. So I hope all of you are ready to unmute yourself whenever you feel the urge and chime in with some comments. And we'll talk about next steps. And then I don't know that we have any members of the public, but I think we want to make sure to reserve some time for public comments if we do have any. Any questions about our agenda for tonight? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this slide says project objectives, but it's more just a few considerations. The city of Newberg completed a housing needs analysis in, I believe, 2019. So, a lot of recent information and data that we have to build off of, and so we can be really informed as you all make recommendations, and eventually the city makes decisions about housing in Newberg in the future. Our main goal here is to comply with House Bill 2001. I assume that Doug already talked to you a little bit about where you are in terms of population as a medium-sized city as opposed to a large city. kind of right on the cusp. And so we're fortunate to be working with you, and Elizabeth will go over this a little bit more, but not only looking at duplexes in the city of Newberg, but also other middle housing opportunities. And so we're going to look at the full range of opportunities with you all, and we're looking forward to that. Next slide. So here's a rough kind of graphic schedule just to help you conceptualize what we're looking at in terms of a process. We have until, I believe, June 15th or so to get our work on this project done. And that includes adopting some provisions around duplexes, and then really getting as far as we can with everything but adoption potentially around other middle housing types. You can see that we are at our first advisory committee meeting in early November here. It's a lot of content. I'm not going to lie to you. There's a lot for us to go through tonight. And at the end of the meeting, we'll kind of see where we're at and see if we need a second meeting. Either, I think we already kind of had potential dates for that. If we need to hold that second meeting, or if there's some other alternative that we want to pursue to a second meeting. But that's why I'm not going to talk too long, because there's a lot of content. This task of kind of looking at the city's code and developing concepts is going to run through December, including a public meeting. Then kind of simultaneously, late this year, we'll begin drafting the actual code update and do another round of meetings with you and with the public. That'll extend, we kind of forecast, through February. And then based on comments from you and the public, we'll put together the final code update and move into the adoption process. I realize it's a pretty fast timeline, maybe not from your perspective, but from ours it is. But there's certainly, that's kind of dictated to us by the state. But are there any questions about the schedule? Okay. Well, with that, I think the next slide is probably Elizabeth. So I'm going to hand it over to her.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks all for being here tonight. As Steve mentioned, we're going to go over a little bit of background to start off with, and then we're going to take it, I like to think of it as the beauty pageant. Your next participant tonight is the Duplex, and then Miss Triplex over here. And so as we go through each pageant contestant in this middle housing tournament, or competition, shall we say, we'll just take a little pause after each one and intersperse the discussion so that we can capture all your comments and discussion around, say, duplexes, while some of the ideas are fresh in your mind before all the different plexes and design standards and things start mixing. Okay. So just, a little bit of background. Probably you're familiar with the major directions that came out of the HNA, the 2019 HNA, showing that the darkest blue here shows the single family detached. No surprise, that is the dominant housing type in Newberg right now, about 71%. And it's still projected to be 60% of all new housing built over the next 20 years. However, what you see is that the other pie slices are projected to get significantly bigger to make up that 10%. In single family attached, and then multifamily here is really going to encompass a lot of the middle housing types that we're talking about. So there's really some opportunity to meet some of Newberg's future housing needs through a mix of middle housing types. Next slide. And so just, to break it down again, the city is looking at about a little over 4,000 dwelling units expected in the next 20 years. And there's already 40% not single family detached projected. And so we're looking to add some variety into that mix. And next slide, please. And that there's the HNA concluded that there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3 key components: making sure there's enough land zone for residential development, which is really more a feature of the comprehensive plan and the UGB analysis. But this central one here, eliminating barriers to residential development. is where we're going to focus to make sure that there are as few barriers to development of these middle housing types as possible. And if there are little pieces that we can get at about this third piece, providing infrastructure in a cost-effective way, we can make some recommendations, but that's probably a much bigger conversation. So we're focusing in on the zoning piece and removing barriers in the zoning code. Next, please. So if you aren't sick already of hearing about HB 2001, this was passed in 2019 by the legislature, and the two key provisions are that medium cities, those cities with a population over 10,000 people, have to allow in the zoning code that duplexes can be constructed on all lots where single-family detached dwellings are allowed. And you'll see we're planners, we love acronyms. So we invented this new acronym, SFDDs, for single-family detached dwellings because it got pretty cumbersome to write out. But that's our contribution to the acronym soup, and apologies for that. But that's what you'll see going through this. So the first piece is the duplexes on all lots. So that's a key distinction in the bill. And this is a part that Newberg needs to comply with by June of 2021. And so that's what's really driving the schedule that Steve was talking about, to make sure that these provisions are not only drafted, but fully adopted by the Planning Commission and City Council. And then the second piece of HB 2001 is that large cities with a population over 25,000 have to allow triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in areas where single-family detached dwellings are allowed. So there's a little bit more flexibility about whether it's on every lot or if there are some lots that are not seen to be suitable for these other middle housing types other than duplexes. There was a lot of wrangling at the state level. That's sort of what's been going on since HB 2001 was passed, as there was statewide rulemaking, and now it's shifted over to the individual jurisdictions like Newberg to take some of what we're learning at the state level and apply it locally. So next slide, please. So for Newberg is in this unique position where the 2019 population was estimated at 24,045, and it's continuing to grow, steadily year after year. So it's possible. There's the latest population projection coming out in December of 2020, and that's sort of the next official count we'll have. It's possible the city's over 25,000 by then, or it's possible it's still just under. But sort of regardless of when the city crosses the 25,000 threshold, we know it's coming. And so the scope that the city laid out and how they scoped the project for us was to say, yes, let's adopt these duplex rules by June 2021, comply with HB 2001, its initial part, but let's also be ready. Let's use this time and this conversation that we're opening up in the community to develop draft middle housing rules and adopt those as a second phase after June 2021. So that gives the city a little bit more flexibility in terms of having more time to review or refine the draft after our initial phase of work concludes in June this year. Next, please. All right. So again, when you start thinking about the duplexes on all lots and the other middle housing types in all areas, there are, of course, the exceptions, right? That's part of what this statewide discussion has been about. So there are certainly some resource areas that are protected by other statewide planning goals. And so to avoid a conflict with other statewide planning requirements, historic landmarks, stream corridors, floodplains, and the Greenway have some additional protections. And then a critical piece is that we're not looking at high density residential. So the R4 zone is not included in this project, and non-residential zones are also excluded from the project, even if a residential uses are permitted there. The idea is that this project and HB 2001 is intended to focus on those neighborhoods where single family detached dwellings are the predominant dwelling type, and to increase the variety of housing allowed in those areas. So if it's a higher density area, there's already additional variety and additional density allowed. So we're not focusing on that with this project. There are also some exceptions for infrastructure constrained areas. And so there's sort of short-term and long-term infrastructure complaints or constraints. Complaints maybe too, I mean, I don't know. But the city is working on what's called let's see if I can get it right. Another acronym for the soup is IBTR, Infrastructure-Based Time Extension Request, I believe. And so the city has secured additional funds through DLCD to evaluate infrastructure and see if there are particular neighborhoods that have constraints, and to identify ways of rectifying those to support the greater density that could come along with middle housing. And so that's sort of the short term. And the exception, there's a different exemption in HB 2001 for these infrastructure constrained areas. If after going through that process, it just becomes clear that the constraint is a very long-term constraint, then there is a different way to treat those areas. But it's primarily for rural areas that have no water, that are on septic, that really could create a health hazard or other concerns. But if it emerges in the community, we'll look at it. And then another one, when I mentioned that we have some fun puzzles specific to Newberg, is dealing with master planned communities. So, you hear us saying we're working in 4 communities. You might worry that we're not giving you each individual attention, or that, you all blur together for us. But let me tell you, that is not the case, because we get this really special circumstances in Newberg. You're really the only community we're working in that has significant master planned communities area. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, about what that's going to mean, but middle housing gets treated differently in those areas. Oh, I tried to advance the slide myself. It doesn't work. So next slide, please. All right. And so as I mentioned, the best and the brightest, and probably a few others, have been getting together in Salem for the last year almost to work on the rules to implement HB 2001. And so the DLCD staff, a rulemaking committee of people all across the state, and other agencies and nonprofits and stakeholders have all gotten together, and the rulemaking process has delivered to us 2 different pathways to satisfy HB 2001 requirements. And the first is they put together a model code for how to allow all the different housing types into your communities. And the model code is meant to, it's a little bit more aspirational than minimum compliance, which is the alternative. So minimum compliance says, okay, well, look, model code is an idea, but if you want to do something else, that's fine, as long as you meet these minimum thresholds, because we think these are the important markers and the important standards that any local code needs to meet or exceed. And in between, there is what I've been calling the window of opportunity for some creativity at the local level to tailor the model code and or the minimum compliance to better meet the city's specific needs. Okay, next please. So in Newberg, when we take into account all those different features of HB 2001 and what we understand from the city's HNA and local priorities, our initial project focus has shown us that we're going to be looking at the residential zones where single family detached dwellings are permitted. So we're looking at the R1, R2, and R3 zones, and as well as the residential professional RP zone. And within those, we're looking for ways to allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And, we're looking to allow all of those through clear and objective standards and review processes. So the idea is that all those uses will be outright permitted uses, and that any standards that apply to them can be reviewed through, a very simple staff level type 1 review, so that it's a yes or a no. Either, that essentially the approval criteria can be boiled down to a checklist. That doesn't mean that they have to be simple or that they have to be easy to meet. It doesn't mean that you can't have high standards. It's just that they have to be very clear what they are and very specific. Okay, next please. All right, and then when you think about, just to give you a visual in the back of your mind when we're thinking about where we're contemplating adding these areas, essentially, it's all the yellow areas and slightly orangish areas around the city. What's interesting in Newberg is the proliferation of various different residential zones along this gradient. So I won't list them all, but it's, you know, the R1, R2, R3, and RP and variants of those. And fun fact, I don't know if you know this, but yellow is like the official planning color for residential zones on zoning maps all across the state, for all I know, the country. So yeah, I don't know, it's not just Newberg. So you are following the official color scheme. Okay, next. Okay, so diving right into the duplexes. So this one is where we, our first beauty pageant contestant tonight. This is the one that is both the easiest and the hardest, in the sense that the state requirements in the model code and minimum compliance are pretty straightforward. So it's simple that way. It can be harder in the sense that, you know, if there is local flexibility sought, it's much harder to find because the standards are pretty straightforward and pretty rigid, shall we say. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing this beauty pageant contestant, but duplexes, essentially what we're looking at is making them a permitted use in the R1, R2, R3, and RP, and treating them as just the same as a single family detached dwelling in all those zones. So a couple things that we ran into in our analysis is that right now the lot sizes are based on the unit count. So that would trigger a larger lot size for a duplex. And in the future, recall that the specific text for HB 2001 is that duplexes are allowed on all the same lots as single family detached dwellings. So it has to be the same size lot. If it's a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size, it's the same for single family detached dwelling as for duplexes, regardless of, you know, the fact that it's a 1 or 2 units. We found that the other dimensional standards, so things like height, setbacks, lot coverage, are identical, treat duplexes and single family detached dwellings the same. So that's great that it complies with minimum compliance and the model code. I guess we could put an asterisk after this, but generally, because the minimum lot sizes control how much density there is, rather than, you know, a max density of a certain number per units in some of these zones. So we're not necessarily dealing with that directly. There are some minimal design standards that apply to duplexes. And again, you can apply clear and objective design standards to duplexes. That's not a problem, just so long as we need to evaluate these and say, there's some that only apply to duplexes, and they either need to be removed from duplexes or they need to be expanded to apply to single family detached dwellings as well as duplexes. As long as you treat them identically, you're fine. And then, you know, a very straightforward issue, but one that has come up in every community so far, is about the parking requirements. So right now, the city's code requires 2 parking spaces per unit, which would be a total of 4 spaces on a duplex lot. And the requirements, if we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the requirements are that the maximum minimum, if that makes sense, the highest number of spaces that the city can require for a duplex under the state minimum compliance is 1 parking space per unit for a total of 2 spaces per unit. And the model code even encourages cities to go further and reduce that to required parking, just eliminating required parking so that it's 0 spaces. Again, so that it gives a builder the flexibility to either add parking or not add parking, depending on the site configuration, what makes sense for the community environment that they're building in. So the parking is going to be one change that we're recommending for compliance. The other concepts that we're recommending are also, you know, just as I said, to get it very, you know, as similar as possible to regulation of single family detached dwellings for uses, lot sizes, dimensional standards, and design. Another piece is allowing the conversion of existing single-family detached dwellings into duplexes. And what's interesting about that is that under the state minimum requirements, that conversion has to be allowed without triggering any additional parking or any additional design standards. So if there is a parking space and it gets converted, that's fine, but it's just that the new standard of 2 spaces per duplex can't be applied to that conversion. And when we're thinking about this conversion and having 2 units on a lot, we need to just clarify the relationship to ADUs, accessory dwelling units that the city already permits. Those are typically a larger house and a smaller house, or in a smaller ADU. And the duplex, you know, it definitely blurs the line, but the main change is that you can have 2 similar size units. And it'll be interesting to see going forward what people choose. You know, if ADUs sort of fall by the wayside because the duplex provisions are so much easier or just make more sense for what people want. Or if ADUs have a more, you know, a specific role to play, or they're more appealing for other reasons. So next slide, please. And then one other concept that we're going to be working on is thinking through whether to allow detached or attached duplex structures. So the stacked duplex and the side-by-side duplex, these graphics all come from the model code, but the stacked and the side-by-side are probably the most traditional that we think of when we think of a duplex. But there's also been discussion about, one, are there different ways to attach, like by a garage wall or a breezeway, that allows a little bit more separation of the primary living space, maybe makes it a little more livable for the residents. And then also, could there be opportunities to build detached duplex units so that they're 2 entirely separate structures, but that share the same lot and that qualify for the same minimum lot size? And so just the minimum compliance requires attached dwellings, and it's optional for the city whether they want to additionally allow these detached options. And this, you can kind of see just looking at these diagrams how we're going to start to overlap with ADU territory pretty quickly, particularly when we're talking about detached structures and whatnot. But I think that the key is just thinking about the relative scale of the 2 units. So any of these diagrams could be redone with ADUs, but the ADU would have to be so much smaller. So next slide, please. So that brings us to our first discussion break opportunity after you've been listening to me. So first is, you know, thinking on those diagrams and whether attached or detached or both make sense for the community, thinking through those parking standards. If the city's interested in going with the 1 space per unit or lowering it further, or if there's any other flexibility to parking, like how on-street parking and parking arrangements on site could be treated. And then also just a review of the minimum lot sizes for single-family detached and duplexes. I think the HNA said perhaps there could be further lot size reductions for single-family detached dwellings, but the consideration for this project is if you reduce them for single-family detached, they, you know, again, we're treating duplexes exactly the same, so it's an across-the-board reduction. So just a consideration there. And then, of course, any other questions or feedback on the slides that we presented so far on duplexes.
Elizabeth, I wonder if it would be helpful to, and sorry, Dominic, if you have something you want to say, to take these one at a time and maybe go back a slide to that nice diagram of attached and detached duplexes so that we have kind of a visual while we tackle that one. But Dominic, if you have something else you want to start with.
I had 2 thoughts. You know, my mother lives in a neighborhood with quadplexes, and there's almost no on-street, or it's almost all on-street parking, and it makes the neighborhood kind of feel very unfriendly to kids playing outside. And I think that's something to consider. If you take away all of the parking spaces, then the streets are going to be full and a little more dangerous. Completely separate from that, I'm sitting in my garage conversion right now and dealing with the city planning office. I have a driveway that fits 2 cars in it, but because it's not 20 feet, 25 feet, I believe, set back from the street, they only consider that as 1 parking space. And so they made me go through the expense and the time to do a paver pathway on the side of my home to where I could park another vehicle more or less in my backyard. And it's something that's completely unusable, something I don't use at all, completely unnecessary just to meet that odd parking requirement. So I think there is something to be said for that. I think that we could adjust those codes and still make things livable. But that's all I had.
Thanks. Other thoughts from the group on the types of attached or detached or both that would be desirable in the community?
Well, when I'm looking at different arrangements, I'm thinking about, of course, if the lot is big enough, choose the style that allows the maximum of daylight coming into those units. So rearranging, turning differently, sun exposure, how the sun travels around the units, so that people get a better quality of living inside when they are inside. And Oregon, yes, we will be spending at least 6 months in a darker gray and kind of environment. So not necessarily putting windows on those walls where I'm looking into my neighbor's kitchen where they are cooking for dinner, but there are different solutions nowadays that could be applied. So really, then it doesn't even feel like I'm in a duplex or something bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Could you?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yeah, balancing privacy and window coverage is a good one.
So could you go over the definition again of duplex? Because I'm sort of having a mind blown moment of the detached duplex concept, and then wondering if we go to cottage cluster eventually, does that sort of fall into that? It's a 2-home cluster. Like, how would that all work?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's great. It does sort of wind up being a continuum, I think, is how I've come to think of it. So the definition of a duplex is 2 dwelling units on a single lot. And then the option is whether that's in an attached configuration or if it's in any configuration, which allows attached or detached. So it's just an option of whether they could be 2 separate structures or they have to structurally be one, but it's only one underlying lot.
Okay.
And then as far as how it relates to cottage clusters, I think that's a great observation that it sort of looks like 2 cottages because they're going to have to be smaller to fit on the lot and if they're detached. But the difference is just that there's only 2 of them. And I guess also that they're not required to face each other or to share sort of a central yard space between them. Like a cottage cluster, they're supposed to be oriented towards each other differently. And cottages are going to pick up at 5 units or more.
I don't know if I have a solution for parking, but some observations in my neighborhood are that most people don't use their garage for their car. And I've thought about doing a study on that because it just seems so universal. And then so there's 1 car in the driveway and then often 1 in the street. And so I've started to just wonder, like, I mean, I know garages are desirable, but they just don't seem, they seem to be used for storage more than cars. And maybe having the flexibility of not needing to have the garage, or having it be an option, not necessary. And another thing I do see, kind of adding on to the point of that driveway not like meeting whatever the code is for having 2 cars fit, is that I see over and over again a second car or an RV extending into the sidewalk permanently. So even though there's a sidewalk, you can't walk on it continuously through the neighborhood. So that is, it's weird, it's kind of frustrating, but that's, you know, people, I think, again, are not using their garage for their car. So then it all spills out. And back to the duplex, I mean, I do think allowing as many types of housing, I mean, you want to be flexible and do as much as you can to allow, personally, to allow as many housing types and variety and choices for owners and developers to, you know, we're in a city and cities are for housing and to house people. So approach it flexibly. So even though like I'm having the mind blown moment, I'm like, well, why not? Why do they have to touch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
And maybe one more thing to add. I'm just looking at those different designs and where I think they're all great and valid. Just from a contractor standpoint, there's far more cost involved in building these separate units. And I wonder just practically if anyone's going to go with anything besides the side-by-side or the stacked duplex, when it seems like they can get larger homes and less material costs out of the same space.
Yeah, I have to agree with that.
Right. And I think, you know, one thing just to underline in terms of our job in writing code is we don't have to predict which of these is going to be a winner. It's just about, you know, we could allow these detached duplexes to have more options. And if people never use it, that's fine. No harm, no foul. You know, I think you make a great point about construction economics, particularly a lot of this middle housing discussion is focused on how can we produce smaller, more affordable housing units. So yeah, certainly making sure that the more affordable option is permitted seems like a key part of our work. But I don't know that we have to rule other things out. But it's, you know, that's part of our discussion tonight.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just had a quick comment on that and make sure my audio is working at the same time. The parking situation with the code might end up being a contentious issue throughout the neighborhood. If you have a single family dwelling that has 2 parking spots and they take one up on the street and the duplex doesn't have but one and they take up all the street parking, I can only assume that would cause conflict within the community or the neighborhood. I think it's a good idea. I just don't know that, I guess I'm playing devil's advocate. It just might be an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think my concern is the parking as well. You know, I think by living in Newberg, you start thinking about all these neighborhoods that parking's an issue. I live in a cul-de-sac. There is no, you know, parking on the street because our driveways are all butted up to each other. And I think about all the downtown housing. There's not parking down there on the street because it's all full, especially the closer you get to the college. So I think parking is an important concern when we talk about Newberg.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, again, this is sort of one of those where there are some specifics in the state code that we're going to have to meet. And then, you know, maybe it comes down to making sure that whatever off-street parking is required is usable, right? That it is spaces that are long enough, but not so long and in bizarre locations that, that you're adding pavers just for the sake of meeting a code standard. So we can look at some of those pieces, how it comes together. But I'm hearing that, I'm not hearing any vocal support for eliminating all minimum parking at this point. Would that be a fair assessment or a fair reflection?
I would concur with that.
I agree too, because with some of the homes that are being built more narrowly, I can hardly imagine there's even barely one spot in front of some of the very narrow homes that we have happening now.
Yeah. Okay. Can we go to the next slide real quick? Okay. And then the last piece that we wanted to discuss here, I'll just say one last thing about parking, right? Which is that, yes, when you think about a duplex coming in, if there's only one parking, 2 total parking spaces off street, and there might well be some overflow of parking onto the street. I think that the key just sort of the context in which I think we should be considering this is that in an infill situation where it's one duplex coming in here or one duplex getting built there or this one house over here getting converted, we want to do our best to make duplexes welcome and a feasible development option. But the estimates for how many of these are going to get created are relatively low. So this idea that, any one person, or one neighborhood in Newberg would wake up and have even 5% duplexes in 10 years from now, let alone, every other house, that would be astounding success. The projections right now are closer to like 1% to 3%. So even if there are some on-street parking impacts that result from some duplexes, hopefully they'll be spread out enough that that it won't be so much a concentrated effort, a concentrated impact, similar to how you've seen ADU production in the past.
I had a quick question, just an interesting thought, a little bit more abstract than that, but I'm wondering with these new rules, people with current ADUs and people who seek to build them, are they going to be able to sell off an ADU now and sell a portion of their land, or is that going to open up a whole new window of issues, especially if the parking doesn't have to be changed if the ADU is already existing?
Well, none of these rules change the land division standards. So right now, the options to sell an ADU would require, in most cases, a condo, right? You'd have to do a condo for the main house and the ADU in order to sell the ADU separately. Or, if it happened to be a large enough lot to do a partition, which could trigger some of these other standards that you're talking about with parking and access. But in short, no, I don't think that there'll be a lot of divisions and selling of ADUs triggered by this. But people that are interested in ADUs might go back and look and say, I wonder, can I expand this? Or are the standards different? Or, somebody that was thinking about building an ADU maybe says, oh, wait, now I can build a triplex. I'd like to look into that. Okay, so then the last piece is just sort of a gauging appetite about whether there's any interest in taking a look at those minimum lot sizes and considering any further reductions that would apply across the board for single family detached dwellings and duplexes. And I realize that I'm not being fair by telling you what the minimum lot sizes are currently. And maybe Heather could jump in and tell me, remind me, I'm going to say Doug knows, 5,000 square feet in R1 and
3,000 square feet in R2.
Nice. Save my bacon.
You're welcome.
What about R3?
R3 is 1,500 square feet per unit.
Okay. So, those are fairly, I was going to say aggressive. I guess we could also say progressive, but those are fairly reasonable minimum lot sizes already for those zones. And I understand the city already, took one whack at bringing them down. But do you think there's any, from this committee, any interest in revisiting those and reducing them further?
I think
Well-
Robert's got his hand up.
Oh, please. Sorry, I can't see all the boxes.
No problem. I'm not sure of the protocol if I need to do the hand up or just blurt in, but my opinion is absolutely not. We already made concessions from, I think it was 19 or 20,000 square foot in the R1, if I'm not mistaken. Some of those sized lots are getting pretty darn skinny for multifamily. I just don't think that it would need to be reduced any further. I think that it would just cause issues, and at what point is it not doable, with lot size? So that's my opinion.
What kind of issues do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at a 1,500, 3,000, you're putting a multifamily on something like that. Not only do you have no parking, you have no backyard, you have no front yard. I mean, and then the structure of the building is going to literally be like one of those skinny houses straight up in the air. So it's just getting too tight. I mean, if there's a builder out there that wants to do it, then by all means let them. But I just don't think you're going to have a lot of demand to build multifamily on such a small lot. There's just no room. I mean, I can't see it happening. You start making the lots even smaller. I just don't see a lot of demand. I don't see a lot of building.
Well, this is Doug, so everybody has a little bit of context. So back in 2010, the city went through a process and reduced its lot sizes. So in R1, we went from 7,500 square feet down to 5,000 square feet.
Okay.
And for our R2, we went from 5,000 square feet to 3,000 square feet. It was done at that time because we were not meeting our target densities of 4.4 dwelling units per acre in R1 and 9 dwelling units per acre in R2. So the city staff and the people who were here at that time looked at using the land more efficiently than what it had been used historically and reduced those lot sizes.
Are we meeting the minimums then?
New numbers right now, because we're doing some updates to our HNA and our buildable land. And the numbers are coming in that, and we do our calculations on gross density, not on net. So right now our R1's coming in at about 4.9, so it's above the target. And our R2's coming in at 7.9, which is below the target of 9. But our R2 zone allows single family and multifamily. So it's really market driven about what a developer wants to do with a particular parcel of land.
And I was thinking before Senate Bill 2001, I believe the duplexes had to have wasn't it a 19 or 20,000 square foot lot? I think that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So where we're at with the way
Before
the code is written now is that to do a duplex in R1, you would have to have a 10,000 square foot lot. And to do a duplex in R2, you would have to have a 6,000 square foot lot. And so we have not really seen any duplex development because the developers have shared with me is if I have to have a 10,000 square foot lot to build a duplex, I'll just do 2 detached single family homes.
Yeah. But correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't the 2001 Senate Bill 2001 change that? Isn't that?
That's what Elizabeth was sharing. So you might want to touch on that again.
Okay.
Yeah, so exactly. The idea is that it's the same minimum lot size has to apply to single family detached dwellings and duplexes. So it's 5,000 for both in the R1 zone right now. And the question is just, is there any appetite to reducing that lot size any further in the R1 zone or the R2? And if so, just knowing that it would affect both single family detached dwelling and duplexes now, that there is no differentiation between the lot sizes for those. But I'm not hearing a lot of interest. You know, again, we're not necessarily recommending it at this time. It's not required by the model code or minimum compliance. It's just sort of an option if there were local appetite for it to sort of right size the minimum lot sizes. Okay, well, any last duplex comments before we move on? Just jump in, by the way, there's no protocol about taking turns or flashing secret signals.
Elizabeth, I'll just let you know that Heather and I are also taking notes. So if that helps you in your facilitation to not have to write as much down, don't worry, we've got it covered.
Oh, great, thank you. We'll put all of our thoughts together afterwards. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide then, please. Let's meet our next contestant this evening. We're looking at triplexes and quadplexes now. So we took a look at the current code and some of, big picture, well, maybe just to back up a little, right? With triplexes and quadplexes, again, the city is being proactive in addressing it now, knowing that, it's now or a year from now. It's not like, there's a big reprieve by waiting. So taking advantage of the momentum, but triplexes and quadplexes, there might be a few lots, a few fewer lots where triplexes and quadplexes can be permitted. If they're in certain resource areas or if there's those infrastructure constraints. But generally, we're looking at the model code and minimum compliance is looking at ways to allow those in single family neighborhoods as well. So when we start from that goal and that requirement and review the current code, we see that triplexes and quadplexes right now fall under the broader multifamily definition, which kind of triggers a whole host of other design standards and development standards that are really tailored to, frankly, more multifamily development. So when you think of what would be necessary, oh, excuse me. What would be necessary for, sorry, I'm having computer issues. There we go. What would be necessary to allow an apartment building is really different than what's needed for a triplex or quadplex. And so, historically, not just in Newberg, but in many places, this means you don't see many triplexes and quadplexes because navigating the apartment standards to build, the tiniest apartment complex ever is really onerous. So some of those issues that we flagged in our analysis is that a triplex and a quadplex as part of a multifamily dwelling would be a conditional use in the R1 zone. It would be permitted in R2, R3, and RP. But the minimum lot sizes are based on the number of units. And so, just like the duplex where you suddenly have to have twice as large a lot in order to have a duplex, you'd have to have 4 times as large a lot to build a quadplex under the current standards. And so, it's just not practical or economical use of land at this point. So probably one of the factors why we haven't seen a lot of recent construction. Some of the other dimensional standards though, setbacks, height, lot coverage are treat all the dwelling types similarly. So we didn't see, flag a lot of problems there. Currently, the way the code is written, the triplex and quadplex, because they're multifamily, would trigger the multifamily design and open space standards. And the parking standards for multifamily range from 1 to 2 parking spaces per unit, which depends on how many, the size of the units based on bedrooms. And those parking spaces generally have to be arranged in, more of a parking lot design. So, you've got your perimeter landscaping and your curbs and your striping and your access aisles. And it, just has the visual impact of a parking lot, as well as taking up an awful lot of land for that additional access and maneuvering area. So next slide, please. Great. So as we're thinking about how we will treat triplexes and quadplexes going forward, we're looking to create a new use category for each of those, along with a definition so that triplexes and quadplexes get removed from that multifamily category and they get treated as their very own use type. And that allows the triplex and quadplex to be an allowed use in both the R and the MR, or sorry, this might be an error, in the R1, R2, and R3 and RP zones. And then the minimum lot sizes get a significant makeover. So the lot size is intended to be either the same as a single family duplex or a single family detached dwelling, or there are some guaranteed minimum lot sizes. So no city is required to have a minimum lot size below 5,000 square feet for a triplex or 7,000 square feet for a quadplex. So say, so for Newberg, in R1, for example, the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet, and that's the same as the 5,000 square foot guarantee for triplexes. So it would be 5,000 for triplexes, but you don't have to allow a quadplex on a 5,000 square foot lot. You can require up to a 7,000 square foot minimum lot size for that because there are additional units. And then, I think, and those are optional. That doesn't mean you have to require 7,000. You could also, allow a 5,000 square foot lot, or it could be 6,000. And then as you move into, the R2, looking at a 3,000 square foot minimum lot size, you can still keep it at 5,000 square feet for a triplex and the 7,000 for a quadplex, or you could bring it down. I don't quite know how you would ever get 4 units on a 3,000 square foot lot. But you don't have to set a different minimum lot size for quadplexes. It's just that you are allowed to. And then when we get into the design standards, so again, instead of regulating it like an apartment complex, there need to be clear and objective design standards if the city wants to require any for triplexes and quadplexes. The model code is very specific, and so it's sort of a buffet, if you will, where there's entryway, window coverage, garage location, and driveway approach standards. And if you want any of those to apply to your plexes, we can take a scoop from the design standard buffet and add it to the code. But there isn't a lot of flexibility to add design standards that address different aspects of design. So this is really everything that's on the menu, the way that it is written. And as we get into parking, it's a very similar story to duplexes. You'll notice this theme tonight. The city is allowed to require up to 1 parking space per unit. So rather than those per bedroom fluctuations, it's just capped at the 1 space. Could be reduced further, but I'm guessing our conversation will be pretty similar to duplexes. So that's how much can be required, as well as looking at ways to add some flexibility in how that parking is treated to try to get out of that parking lot design that I was talking about. And that's for 2 reasons. One, if we're thinking of these as infill or integrated into neighborhoods of single family detached, you don't want a parking lot in the middle of that. That, just really does not add to the neighborhood characteristic. But it also just takes up so much land on the site that it would make, there wouldn't be anything left on a 5,000 or 7,000 square foot lot to build the structure itself if, you're using all of it for a parking lot. And then last piece that we're looking at adding to the code is this allowing the conversion of single family detached dwellings into a triplex or a quadplex, exempt from adding any additional parking or meeting any additional design standards beyond what was applied initially to that dwelling. And this one is, I would say a work in progress, right? The zoning code can certainly permit this conversion. I'm sure there are some experts here that will chime in to say that, remind us that there's a residential building code that applies to individual 1 or 2 unit structures, and the commercial building code kicks in at 3 units or more. And so that just, you know, is a different class of builders and of planning and of review standards and construction type. And so trying to go from a single family detached dwelling built under the residential building code to a triplex under the commercial building code, you know, on the one hand, that isn't our problem. We're doing zoning code here, but the building code could well impede any of these conversions for a while. I understand they're working on that also at the state level. So I think we take care of our business by dealing with it in the zoning code, but so that you know, this isn't a very likely outcome. So it's not something to worry about quite so much happening. So next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, the buffet of design standard options really get at how the entryways can be required to be oriented, requiring up to 15% window coverage for street facing walls, and then requiring where those garage and off-street parking spaces can be located, and that driveway approach so that it you know, doesn't dominate the frontage of the site. So you're not just seeing, you know, garage, garage, driveway, 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 and no house behind it. So those are big picture, some pieces, and hopefully you had a chance to leaf through the model code that has some more diagrams that we set in your packet. And next. And then with plexes, we also get to dive into this same question about attached or detached configurations. So, you know, certainly a replay a lot of the good concepts you all brought up, that there could be some more flexibility, but there could be more costs associated with this. But here are some different diagrams and graphics that they came up with in the model code to help people start thinking about what attached versus detached plex structures might look like. And I guess just to, you know, to follow up on our discussion about the spectrum of housing choices, you can see in the lower right there that the detached quadplex example starts to look, you know, pretty similar to what you might think of as a cottage cluster. And I think that the only definition or the only distinction gets to be the number of units, right? If you were to allow detached quadplexes, then, you know, it's essentially a 4-unit cottage cluster, which could be great, could be a really interesting use, could be the right site, but it adds more flexibility. It just looks a little different than what some people might be thinking of with a quadplex. Okay, and next. Hola. Okay, so to turn it over to some discussion on these triplex and quadplex issues, you know, first question is sort of the same. What is the level of interest in allowing the detached configuration in addition to the attached for these plex units? And same story here as duplexes. You know, attached is the baseline, but there could be additional flexibility added with the detached option.
I mean, personally, again, I'm fine with it as long as, you know, like it does provide more choice. The only thing I noticed is the one that's the 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top. Some design standards could be called for there to have some, what is that, like articulation, so it doesn't just look like a box. You know, like just there's your box on the street.
Okay, any other thoughts? How about not hearing much? We can always come back to it, but any thoughts about parking here? How does this, you know, how's this the same or different from duplexes in your guys' opinion?
As far as the parking goes, I think that could be a problem. I mean, if the lot's big enough, you could put the 4 plexes on there, the detached, you know, but well, I really worry about the parking, honestly. I'm worried that it's going to cause diversions in the neighborhood, and they're going to use some finger pointing, you know. That's those people over there, the duplex people, you know, and so that concerns me. I don't know, to separate those units, I don't see a problem with it as long as we have the parking for it. But to separate those units, you'd have to have a very large lot. And so I don't know if it makes sense to do it that way. So I doubt you'll get much desire to build non-attached quad or triplex units.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
I was a little bit worried when I saw that you could turn the single family dwelling to the quadplex without making any additional parking requirements. That means a house that had 2 parking spaces could then have 4 homes on it and only 2 parking spaces. So, but I'm struggling between the conversation of should we and can we? And can we, of course, and I guess the free market is going to decide should we. So I guess that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah, you know, it is an interesting provision that they added to the state requirements about allowing those conversions. So, yeah, I'll be curious to see how it plays out.
I wonder if something could come into play, like the closer you are to town, the fewer parking spots you have. Like if you're within a quarter mile, starting with these tris and quads, because really, I mean, I'm a half mile from a mile, 3/4 of a mile to downtown. So we walk down there, but you know, our friends who live closer, they do a lot of walking. I mean, I would like to think that people would make those kind of decisions before moving in, but I don't know if they really do. They're just like, we're going to put all our cars here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll, you know, since parking inevitably is about personal anecdotes, you know, like there are plenty of days that I don't drive, but I still have a car that I, you know, have to leave somewhere because what if I want to go camping someday or, you know, have that really big grocery run? Like, yes, I can walk my daughter to school and I don't even go to work anymore, but can ride my bike to work, except that the car is still somewhere. But to your particular suggestion, Melissa, about differentiating parking requirements based on distance, that is definitely something that we could do, and that's actually, you know, a fairly proven tool for parking requirements. That parking demand does scale somewhat to distance to, I was going to say attractors, you know, attractive destinations, desirable destinations. The only thing is that we have kind of a compressed scale, right? We could work between 0 and 1 parking spaces. So, you know, maybe if you're within a quarter mile, you go to half a space, right? Like 2 total spaces for a quadplex. But we just don't have, we can't bump it up any higher than 1 for any dwelling. So, you know, if there's interest in sort of playing within that relatively small sandbox, it's definitely feasible.
I know there's some jurisdictions in California that allow you to put in a bike rack, a bike lock, and a certain amount of bike locks or racks count as a parking space for a car.
Mm-hmm.
It's just is a function of how far away you are from like a bus stop.
Sure.
And I feel like those kinds of rules are kind of just cheats and workarounds, and they don't end up really being used in the right way, and you still end up with all those cars flooding the street. So from what I'm hearing, it sounds like parking is the number one issue. I'm not a fan of taking the minimum requirement down to 0.
Yeah, any other thoughts about parking here?
Well, I have a corner lot currently in Newberg, and corner lot provides plenty of parking spots. So for those bigger arrangements, maybe reserve those corner lots available for building more on, so gaining more parking spots that way.
Yeah, I think what that reminds me of, Gabriel, is that some jurisdictions use on-street parking credits, right? Where if you have 20 to 25 feet of frontage along the lot, you can count that as one of your spaces. And so certainly if you have a corner lot, you're going to have more than one space that you could count. So it might make sense to contemplate that as a way of meeting the parking demand and recognizing the additional frontage that comes with corner lots. So, I mean, philosophically, I think the tricky thing about on-street parking credits is, you know, I think as has come up a few times tonight already, there's always this tension for people to think, oh, that parking space in front of my house is mine. And therefore, if a duplex moves in next door, they're taking my space. And allowing on-street parking credits can sort of fuel that sense of ownership a little bit more, even though, you know, it doesn't in any way transfer the public right-of-way to private property owners. But, you know, in some people's minds, it might sort of create more of an expectation of that. So just something to keep in mind. But yes, I like that's one way we could think about corner lots, or, you know, it could also be written in some way that is more specific to corner lots.
What are you saying, Elizabeth? Not everybody wants the 1976 International four-wheel drive rusted out pickup in front of their house?
Well, if it's your rusted out pickup, maybe you do want it in front of your house.
That's good point. Good point.
Or maybe you really don't. Maybe you don't want to look at it.
That's why it's in front of the neighbors.
Yes. Out of sight, out of mind.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that you know, sort of some helpful thoughts around that. Just, you know, as we're maybe moving along here, thinking about another area that we flagged, and I don't have any specific proposals, but we're also thinking that we might take another look at the dimensional standards. So things, particularly on this one, the lot coverage and the setbacks that apply to plexes. So when we have some of these smaller lots, you know, if they're capped at a certain lot coverage, you know, you can easily fit a 2,000, 3,000 square foot home, you know, and only take up half the lot. But you could be getting into, you know, here we're sort of balancing for feasibility purposes to actually fit those 4 units. You might want to be able to cover more of the lot with a building. So, you know, if you want to build, say, 4 1,000 square foot units, let's, for sake of argument, say, you know, then that could be, you know, 4,000 square feet on a 5,000 square foot lot. We're looking at 80% lot coverage, which is higher than what would be allowed in the code now. So the 2 ways of thinking about this is sort of, one, it supports development feasibility to actually get these plexes built to add a little bit more flexibility. But there can definitely be some concerns about compatibility within neighborhoods if the scale and bulk of these plexes can wind up being larger than some of the other residential structures in the neighborhood. So there's a bit of a, it's not necessarily a trade-off, but there are multiple issues to consider there. But we'll take a look and see if we have any specific recommendations or feedback. Any general comments that you'd like us to consider as we develop any proposals there?
I don't know what the single family lot coverage maximum is, for comparison's sake.
Sure. Doug, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So in our R1 zone combined for the house and your driveway is 60%.
Yeah. Okay.
Same thing in the R2. And then there's some subsets to that. In R1, if you are a 1-story house, the house can be 40%. No, if it's a 1-story house, it can be 50%. If it's 2 stories, it's 40%, or maybe I have that backwards. So we have some subsets to that. So it's most of our developments that are occurring now, the typical detached single family home is under the 60%. but they're kind of pushing, that 50% window of that 60% max.
Sure.
When you're getting into those larger coverages, I think you have to worry about permeable surfaces too, and water drainage. And if you're covering 80% of the lot with driveway and roof, then you really have nowhere for the heavy rain flow to go, or I don't know, just something to consider.
Yeah, sure. The stormwater implications. Right.
So we're going to make concessions for the duplexes and the triplexes in regards to utilizing the lot in the back sets. I mean, if we're going to make this happen in regards to promoting affordable housing, middle row housing, we're going to have to do something, and we're going to have to make some concessions here. And so, I would be all for utilizing as much as the lot as possible to incentivize middle row housing. And if that means, we're 3 feet off of the lot line or 4 or whatever, I'd be all for that. I mean, we could figure something out with the stormwater drain. If the lots, be the angle of the lot, I guess. Somehow we get it to run out to the road or something. I'm sure there's something that we can be figured out, but I'd be all for utilizing all the lot. I mean, most tenants have no desire to maintain a yard. And
I mean, most people, right?
Most people, yeah. So, and there's so many parks anymore in this area that I think that would give them an outlet. I mean, it's not something that I think is the greatest, but like I said, if we're going to incentivize middle row housing, we need to come up with options that incentivize that, and I think this could be one of those. So I would be all for it.
Okay, thanks. Any other thoughts here before I want to do kind of a quick time check and see how we want to proceed as we're getting close to the end of our scheduled time? But any last thoughts on plexes before we do that? Okay, well, I shall seize the Zoom momentum. So we are running right, it's 7:30, right, that we agreed to wrap up tonight?
8.
Oh, 8. Oh, I had this on my calendar wrong. Great, I'll keep going then. Great, so, but that does mean we have about a little more than half an hour. So maybe we'll, to make sure that we touch on all the topics, maybe, I'll try to go a little bit faster, give you a little bit more of an overview. And then as we get into next steps, we can talk about how to further supplement, the background and discussion on those pieces as a next step. So next slide, please. Okay, so our next middle housing contestant is townhouses. And so the city of Newberg already permits these as single family attached dwellings. They require a special use permit in the R1, R2, R3, and RP zones. And they require a higher level of review, a type 2 rather than a type 1, which can take a little bit more time for review. Right now, the minimum lot sizes are the same as single family detached dwellings. That sounds like a good thing, but actually, if you think about it, you'd probably want a smaller lot size to do a townhouse, to make it more feasible. And right now they require 2 parking spaces per unit, and you can't use any on-street parking credits to meet that. So next slide. So with townhouses, we're looking, first of all, to make them an outright permitted use in those 4 residential zones. And then the minimum compliance from the state is surprisingly straightforward and not flexible on this topic, in that a minimum lot size of 1,500 square feet has to be permitted in all of those zones for townhouses, with a minimum the minimum lot width cannot be greater than 20 feet. So that makes it a little bit more feasible to fit those in a line, I guess. And there's some changes to the setbacks and the dimensional standards, making sure allowing a reduced front setback so that it's only 10 feet and increasing the building height to 35 feet in order to allow a full 3 stories of construction, in part because it allows a garage to take up pretty much the whole of the first floor, which ties right into moving towards a reduced parking standard of 1 space per unit. And here we also get a buffet of design standards that we can choose from to apply. So next slide. They're pretty similar in terms of you get to talk about entryway orientation, which is all about, you know, bringing the front door closer and more visible to the street. Some unit definition, that's where we pick up these articulation concepts that I think Melissa, I think I'll give you credit for that one, was mentioning. Things like bay windows and eaves and other trim options. They've also carried across, you can allow 15% minimum window coverage, and then there's driveway access and parking, different layouts, which tend to be one of the trickiest things about townhouse design is, you know, how do you prevent just a solid row of garage doors and driveways, you know, especially when you're talking about these 20-foot wide lots. So there are some different standards about that that require either shared driveways or rear alleys to access all the parking, some other kinds of shared access to try to tone that down a little bit. Although, you know, there really is still just a lot of cars and a lot of driveways to serve. So next, please. So discussion, first piece is how many attached units do you want to permit as part of a townhouse project, and should that be differentiated by the different zones? So the minimum requirement is from the state is that at least 4 attached units have to be permitted in any zone. But, you know, the sky's the limit. I think most cities that have a limit I've seen as high, you know, 8 is probably the highest, or some cities have no limit. But that, you know, not to put, you know, words in your mouth or anything, but as a potential, you could consider, say, doing 4 attached units in R1, but 8 units in R2 and R3, or maybe some other numbers make more sense to you. But there is some flexibility there. We're also looking, there are some, when I talked about those design standards, there are some existing standards in the Newberg Code that map pretty well onto what the model code design standards are. So we could keep them, you know, with just some small modifications, or we could adopt the model code more wholesale, or really, you know, cut back on some of those standards if needed. And then we'll also talk a little, you know, again, there's the parking standards question and how it gets arranged, particularly what you'd like to see done with driveways. So maybe you turn it over, let's try to say about 5-7 minutes of discussion here on townhouses.
I got something as always. I don't have any problem with allowing as many units as possible. I think it saves cost to not have an extra 2 sides of siding and paint and everything else, and an extra strip of land. They run into maybe some issues with utilities and bringing utilities to all these separate units when they're so far between them. But then also the window standards, they're marked at 15% minimum. I don't really see any use in having a minimum at all there. I think that the market's going to kind of decide how many windows people are going to want and need. And I think it's a good thing to have windows, but I don't think it's a big deal for us to set minimums for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just by comparison, there isn't a similar standard for single family dwellings. And I bet all of you live in homes with windows. Or maybe you live in a different type of dwelling unit, which is great too. But I bet it also has windows. Okay.
I also think that townhouses and different designs nowadays allow to be more sensitive when looking at how many units, what style to blend in, to be more aesthetic or be in sync with the environment where the townhouses will be built. So there are options nowadays that allows for playing with that and choosing something that fits.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess also just to call us back to the HNA, I can't remember the exact percentage, but there is definitely forecasted growth for demand for townhouses in Newberg going forward. So, you know, hopefully we can get these rules right and get some built. Some of the advantages, right, of townhouses is that there is a path to home ownership because they're fee simple and individual lots, but hopefully lower costs with those attached units and smaller sizes.
I would agree with what Dominic had to say on the townhouse issue. So,
Okay, great. Okay. Okay, should we move on? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so cottage clusters. This is a fun one because, you know, the Newberg Code really didn't have anything on this subject. And, you know, I just want to reassure you that you are far from alone in this problem. You know, cottage clusters is a new kind of use, and so most cities don't have anything to address this yet, which is, you know, kind of the whole purpose of HB 2001. So next slide. So what we're looking to do with this new cottage cluster concept is, first of all, to define and permit what a cottage cluster can be. So as we were talking about with, you know, looking at those detached quadplexes, a cottage cluster is a collection of detached units that's 5 units or more. And it can be, right, as it says right here, you can cap it at 8 units being allowed in a cluster, or you can, you know, allow more units in a cluster than 8. 12 is a pretty common standard in those cities that do have cottage cluster standards already, but I've certainly seen, you know, analysis that says that having a much higher limit or no limit at all can add a lot of flexibility for different size lots. But the main concept is you're going to allow more smaller homes on a single lot that are not necessarily facing the street, you know, just one after another, like a traditional subdivision layout. And instead they're going to be clustered around a common open space. So there are some, like, I don't know why I still struggle with this, but there's a very specific requirement in the state code that, well, actually it was in HB 2001 itself, not even in the minimum compliance, but a cottage is limited to a 900 square foot footprint, and cities have no discretion to increase that. What you can do is you can allow more building area. So the building area itself can be capped anywhere at 900 square feet if it's a 1-story house, up to 1,800 square feet if it's 2 stories, or some number in between, right? A lot of cities will pick to say, you know, an individual cottage can only be 1,200 or 1,400 or 1,500 square feet, or that all the cottages in the cluster can't exceed an average of 1,200 square feet or whatever the number is. So there is some flexibility in the total size or the average size of cottages, but the footprint of 900 square feet cannot be changed. I don't know why, I just feel like that's an odd thing that to not let cities go higher if they wanted to, but not an option. And I guess, you know, the trade-off is just, again, these are supposed to be smaller units, but you get more of them because there's effectively no maximum density that gets applied to cottage clusters. You can fit, you know, this cluster of 5 or more units on any lot of 7,000 square feet or more. if you can figure out how to fit it onto the lot itself. I will say that, some of the best practices and analysis I've read show that, it's really hard to fit 5 detached units, even with 900 square foot footprints, onto a 7,000 square foot lot, especially when you add in the off-street parking, the perimeter setbacks, and the common open space that needs to be in the middle. So, as far as a more reasonable minimum lot size estimate, I'm not sure that I am prepared to give you a number, but just to say, here's an example of where we're going to allow something in code, but it's going to be a little different as it gets sorted out on individual lots. But as far as the zoning code goes, we will comply. So next slide, please. I think I have some examples how these might actually line up. And you have Heather to thank tonight for all these great graphics. So
Thank you, Heather.
yeah, so here's an example of how this cottage cluster might play out. And you'll notice that they did not say how many square feet this lot would necessarily be. I guess, anyway, maybe we could reverse engineer it somehow. But the idea, again, is just that there are these smaller individual detached homes clustered around a common courtyard with some internal pedestrian walkways. They're still set back from, they have the same front setback, rear setback, and perimeter setbacks as, any other development in the R zones. But in this example, the parking is clustered in a parking pod, I think they call it, or a parking cluster, rather than being individual garages associated with the cottages. And then next slide. Let's see what but I think a lot of those features of the cottage make it a really tough nut to crack, as I like to say. So I'm sure the squirrel would agree with me. He hasn't found very many cottage clusters to bury his walnuts in, because across the state, we have just not seen very many cottages get built. So, the model code that came out, I can understand some of the features and some of the aspects, that they were trying to balance when they did it. But in my humble opinion, I don't think that the model code goes very far to making these feasible cottage projects to construct. So if we go to look at the next slide, I think that there are really some ways that, if the city of Newberg is interested, there are ways that we could increase the feasibility of cottage clusters over and above the model code. Where we'd still meet minimum compliance, but we would exceed the model code. So a couple of the features, this is an example from Hayden Homes of a project they built, and I'm afraid I actually don't know what jurisdiction it is. But this was sort of their take on something that is pretty similar to the cottage code or the cottage cluster concept. You can see it's a lot of smaller individual homes on a larger lot, and they're not all facing the street. But instead, in this case, some of them are arranged around a courtyard, and there's certainly green space spread throughout the development. But rather than just getting that parking off to the side, which certainly has its benefits for design perspectives, kind of recognizes more that there is a demand for parking, and it loops the parking through the site, so that each unit has parking that's more proximate to the individual units, a little easier to access. So right now, you couldn't build this layout under the model code. So, one thing that Newberg could consider is requiring, adding some more flexibility to that courtyard orientation standard and how the parking is arranged. And then next slide. And also on the parking issue, here's another example that Hayden Homes did that, again, isn't maybe officially a cottage cluster, but achieves pretty similar objectives. And this was one that was done for fee simple ownership. And so created individual lots for all of the clusters, but at a much smaller scale. So all these homes were less than 1,500 square feet or so. But the representative shared this or you know, the builder shared this to show, you know, there's green space throughout. Many of these are oriented towards these common tracks. But what differentiates this is that it adds an option for individual garages for each of the cottages, which, you know, you can imagine is a desirable amenity for many homeowners. So, you know, from the alleys, you know, this is sort of what the rear garages looked like. So they were even able to get a double car garage into these pretty small units. And right now under the model code, you couldn't do this because of the orientation requirements, and also because the building footprint is capped at 900 square feet. You know, you can't spend 400 square feet of that on a garage. So the model code is still a little bit in flux. There's some final revisions, and we'll see. There's definitely been some movement to add some square footage in to allow garages. Maybe not 400 square feet, but I think the latest is to allow an additional 200 square feet for a garage, just, you know, to make this a little bit more feasible. But, you know, you can see that there are really, you know, this example and the others gets us pretty far from, you know, the more traditional cottage code that the model code is built around. So I think there is more latitude here, depending on where you want to take it. So next slide. Okay, so brings us to some of our discussion points. First of all, we can talk about, you know, how many units could be allowed per cluster. And then one other point that didn't come up in those examples, but another way that Newberg could choose to exceed the model code is that right now the cottage cluster is all about detached, you know, cottages per se. Some cities have experimented with allowing attached units in that same cluster configuration. So you get sort of the benefits of the cluster and some of the cost savings of having attached units. So you might have like duplexes, a duplex cluster. So that is one thing that the city could consider. Another one, like we just saw in that second Hayden Homes example, was whether to create a path through the subdivision code to allow for cottage projects to create these individual fee simple lots. Requires some flexibility about lot frontage requirements and utility and other easement issues. There's the orientation issues about how it's related to the courtyard. And then again, you know, repeated theme about the number of parking spaces and how they're arranged and what kind of priority this group would place on making it feasible to add those individual garages to cottages, because that would require some changes from the model code.
I'm just wondering how ownership and maintenance of those cottage clusters usually works. Is there normally like an HOA, or are these usually renters that are paying into a larger entity? Or are people getting ownership of these homes and building equity and taking, you know, control of their home and their life?
Yeah, no, great question. So the short of it is we don't have many examples yet. The cottage clusters that I'm familiar with were done as condos. So people were able to buy their individual cottages, and then there is an HOA to take care of the common spaces. But I personally think, you know, and having read best practices, and, you know, this isn't like just a personal hypothesis, but, you know, having read other people's recommendations, I think an important choice is allowing that subdivision option. Condos run into, there's a lot of condo defect liability legislation that can make a lot of developers shy away from condos, which would mean that these cottages could only be rentals, which I think limits their utility and applicability in communities. So having the subdivision option would allow for fee simple ownership, and probably there would have to be an HOA to take care of the common spaces and parking.
Okay.
There is some similar builds in Newberg, like this cottage cluster that you described. and they're duplexes and they're attached. Over by the Newberg High School, there's a few in there. I'd say there's probably 8 of them, you know, and they're attached. They have a common area, no garages, very affordable rentals. The thing is I think they're on 20,000 plus square foot lots, and they're all from the 60s, if I remember right, maybe some 70s, you know, back when land was cheap.
Yeah. Sorry, this preview of coming attractions, but before we get into the master plan communities, any other, you know, initial thoughts on cottages?
Are we able to go back a slide so we can see those questions again? Thank you.
I still think the parking's important no matter which house you go with. So keeping the one space minimums.
I think we've heard that same comment for each, right? For each of the different types we've discussed.
Yeah. Looks like Elizabeth might be frozen.
I have faith she'll come back. Whether she exits out and comes back or just reappears.
I think she was shocked by my comment.
I think what we're going to want to do now is figure out what we want to do with the rest of our meeting time, and Elizabeth can chime in, but we do have a second meeting potentially on November 18th, because I don't think we're going to be able to get through the rest of these. But another option is that Elizabeth could work through the rest of the presentation, and we could, you know, use something like a survey for you to weigh in on the additional comments. Doug, do you have any strong feelings either way about whether we should have a second meeting, or if there's other, or are there restrictions on people's ability with quorum and issues of that nature to comment on these things in between meetings?
Yeah, there are, since it's a public body.
Yeah.
So it'd be best if they actually did meet. So if they were sharing things, otherwise they'd have to send stuff individually to me. Nobody else could see it. Then I'd have to get it back to Steve, and then they have to put it together in order to bring it back. So there's a lot of extra steps involved in that.
So even if we do meet a second time, hi Elizabeth, welcome back. We could, in theory, send out a survey where people wouldn't see each other's responses until the next meeting. Is that right? To just get some additional feedback leading up to that meeting?
That's correct.
Okay. So Elizabeth, I tried to forward that conversation a little bit. I don't know if you want to try to work through the rest of your presentation, but Doug was leaning towards, yes, we should have a second meeting on November 18th, but maybe we can find ways to make it a little bit shorter, more like an hour, if we can make some a little bit of progress between now and then.
Great. No, I like all of that. Yeah, sure. Maybe we just touch on our last topic for tonight. If we could go forward, we'll just talk a little bit about master plan communities and then wrap up. So the unique fun puzzle in Newberg is that there are 4 different master planned areas, 5, including the airport. So Springbrook and Northwest Newberg and Springbrook Oaks, I guess there's a lot of Springbrooks, and the Riverfront sub-district. And so together these total about 58% of the buildable land and nearly all of the entirely vacant land. There's some like partially vacant land within the city limits, but the truly just buildable blank slates are in these areas. So next. So Springbrook up in the north. Next. The airport residential district. The only zoning code I've ever seen where you have to have a hangar for your plane with every single family dwelling. Next. Northwest Newberg is, well, in the northwest of Newberg. And Springbrook Oaks is in the east of Newberg. And next, a little bit south of Springbrook itself. And then the Riverfront subdistrict in the south. So next. And the reason that I highlight these areas is not just that, they have all this potential because there's so much vacant land, but that they can be treated a little differently under HB 2001. So first of all, the duplex piece really stays the same. So we'll need to go in and amend the specific plans and different agreements and codes that apply in each of these areas to allow duplexes on every lot, because that's just the requirement. But as far as the other middle housing types, the state was cognizant of the fact that, when communities master plan areas, one, they have sort of a vision for it, and two, infrastructure really gets sized to meet the number of units that are being expected there. So if, areas have been master planned at X density and all of a sudden, they have to quadruple their potential production up to, by allowing quadplexes, that could just really undermine a lot of the long range planning that communities have done across the state through these master plans. So for master plans that, were approved prior to this whole process, which, these 5 in Newberg have done, the other middle housing types can be limited. You can also go ahead and permit them, just as you're doing throughout the rest of the city. But, if there isn't that interest to do it in these areas, those housing types can be limited for initial build out only, provided that the master plans allow for a net density of 8 units per acre as a minimum. And you can average that, if there are different pockets of density throughout the master plan, and provided that subsequent redevelopment of middle housing is permitted. So, right now as it builds out, it could be single family or duplex. 50 years down the line, somebody wants to, tear out their home, or there's a vacant lot that, a remnant lot, and they want to build a cottage cluster. I mean, God only knows what the zoning code will be like then, but the subsequent redevelopment has to allow for that, for all those middle housing types. So next slide, please. So we have some questions, just about how we think about these master plan communities. And most fundamental is just, should middle housing types be limited in those areas as is allowed, or should they be permitted similar to the other residential zones? And I guess if we have like lightning round initial feedback, would love to hear it. Otherwise, we'll make sure that we include this in the survey and our next discussion. So any first impressions?
Well, I would probably permit them in all zones. I mean, if we're trying to incentivize affordable housing and middle row housing, then I mean, to regulate them just into the master plan, I don't know that would be enough. I'd say open the floodgates and try to allow it pretty much anywhere needed, anywhere desired.
Okay. Any other initial thoughts?
I'd say allow it if they want to do it.
I'm trying to understand. Master plan areas are areas that have already been mapped out for development. And so by saying that we would open it up, open the floodgates, then the builder isn't required to do that. They just have the option.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good distinction.
So I'd be like, yes. I mean, I think that's great.
Okay.
Some of the residents in the really nice developments might be a little upset, but they didn't buy the dirt, I guess, all of it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, if it's a really nice development and it's been put in pretty recently, there isn't going to be a lot of redevelopment. You know, maybe the next phase down the street could be a mix, but you know, it just doesn't seem as likely that we'd see infill in those neighborhoods.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Next, please, let's just talk about where we go from here in our last few minutes. Okay, so, you know, we have kind of a potpourri of other smaller issues that we identified, and we'll work on that next. Okay, so sounds like you were touching on this a little while I was, you know, dealing with IT. But we do have time reserved for a second meeting on November 18th. And this idea that we could get some written comments and or a survey, specific questions, feedback from you before then could really help us guide and tailor that discussion. So did I come in right at the end to hear that that did seem useful and interesting to the group?
We didn't hear from the group. We just confirmed that it was possible.
Okay.
So I guess the question for the group is, would you be interested if we sent out a survey with some of these same questions, and I think we can send out the PowerPoint as well. Would people be interested in kind of thinking some more about this and providing some thoughts before that next meeting? Or would you rather, I guess, revisit some of these last items on November 18th? Is that right, Elizabeth?
Mm-hmm. And like, do you have specific questions for us that, you know, you could provide either through the survey or through just, you know, emails? Do you have any homework that you'd like us to do, additional material you'd like us to bring back to inform that discussion on the 18th? I know it's a lot tonight, so yeah, we just want to give you some different ways to work through it.
I mean, I'd be okay with the survey, you know, anything I can do to help. I mean, I'm signed up because I want to make a difference. So, you know, whatever it takes.
I think the key here is, Elizabeth, we want to make sure that a survey is going to be useful if we're going to spend the time pulling it together. So I guess the question is, if we're meeting on November 18th, is that sufficient, or do people feel like they have more that they'd like to kind of think about and get out, write down, have some other opportunity to share in between now and then? And I appreciate your comment, Robert. I didn't mean.
I mean, maybe we split the difference and just, we could send out an email to everybody with, 5 to 10, relatively open-ended questions, just to help you all focus your feedback, and, anything you could send back related to that, particularly, like I said, any homework questions or clarifications. And then, that wouldn't be a big time investment for us, that would delay in getting it out. But it would give you a little bit of a framework to get your comments back to us, if you have any.
Elizabeth, Doug did mention that there are, public body and quorum issues. So they would have to send those comments individually to Doug rather than as a group. Yes,
I think that makes sense. I mean, I agree. It meets legal minimums.
How does that sound, Doug? We'll send out the PowerPoint and a few targeted questions, and if people want to send some thoughts to you, we can. But if they want to just hold and wait for November 18th, they can do that as well.
That sounds fine. I can, if you guys want to put together the questions that you want, I'll get those. Then I can send out the questions and the PowerPoint to everybody. Everybody gets blind copied. And then if you got thoughts, and we could email offline and say, when do we need the comments back by, so that you have enough time before the 18th meeting. And hopefully the 18th meeting will be, an hour long. So
I think we can probably plan on that, right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Great. That work for the committee. If I see heads shaking up and down, I'm thinking, yep. Okay.
Great. Well, we'll keep working through these issues, and then I guess at our next meeting we'll give you a little bit of a roadmap of what our next steps and how we'll use all your feedback to get us to a public open house in the beginning of December, and then onwards to drafting some code in short order after that.
Well, this is the point where we have the opportunity for any public comment. Sue, do we have any public out there?
We do not.
Okay, no public comment. So Melissa, this is the point where you can call for a motion to adjourn.
Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn at 8 o'clock?
I motion to adjourn at 8 o'clock.
All right. Meeting adjourned.
I don't have to second that.
Yes, we do. Yeah, we
Or
do.
did we need
a
a second?
Second.
Shoot. And do we have a second?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, second, third. Hey, I just want to take a minute real quick before everybody gets off this meeting. I missed the first meeting. I apologize. Just got caught up in work and things weren't going the way I envisioned them, so I didn't make it. But quick introduction. My name is Robert Moxley, third generation resident and small time buy and hold property investor. So I recognize some of the faces from some of the other committees that I've been on, and just happy to be a part of this. So
Thanks, Robert. Okay, well, I guess we'll adjourn here then after we've had our second from Dominic at 8:02 and see everybody next time.
Thank you all.
So much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.